Drake is the what? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to John Dudley Speaks. I'm your host, Copium. Aubrey Drake Graham really doesn't need a long-winded introduction because his name just speaks for itself. Drake has become synonymous with success over the course of the last 15 years in mainstream hip-hop, but with the Billboard Hot 100 records and the sold-out concert tours and consistently outperforming streaming numbers, there come some complications once you become the biggest artist in your respective genre. Complications that Drake has started to experience in the last 8 years or so. Following an unbeatable run from Take Care through What a Time to Be Alive, as well as continued commercial viability with the record-breaking Views and the surprisingly eclectic and ultimately influential More Life, Drake was on top of the world in the mid to late 2010s. However, he lost a lot of the credibility he once had when he lost the beef to Pusha T in 2018, and since then, not only has Drake's creativity dwindled, but the smash hits are just not lasting as long as they used to in the cultural conversation. Scorpion was huge, yes, but it was a slog to get through and it was poorly mixed. Dark Lane demo tapes was underrated yet forgettable and sleepy, and Certified Lover Boy was more of the same, just with extra padding that spared no expense at securing a chart position. Then there's Honestly Nevermind, Her Loss with 21 Savage, and For All the Dogs, personally my favorite run from him since his early work. And while his explorations into Baltimore club and southern rap and even reggaeton turned out to be fun, a lot of it seemed inauthentic. Enter Kendrick Lamar, who also thought so, and really not much else can be said about how Kendrick bodied Drake in last year's rap beef. So where does Drake go other than Australia after such a massive loss? Well, to use Kendrick's words, back to the melodies. PARTYNEXTDOOR, an OVO signee that Drake's been shepherding for the last decade, has been talking about a collab album with Drake for years. But now, finally, it's a reality. Especially since the timing's right, and Drake could really use a win right now that would give him some quick virality. It's just too bad that Some Sexy Songs for You is the most vacuous project from either one of these artists to date, showing that it's still possible to phone it in on the thing you're good at, rendering it completely aimless, pointless, and weightless. With cheap production coming from PARTYNEXTDOOR himself and longtime OVO sound engineer Noel Cadastre, there's flourishes across this track listing that call back to the cold, jet black aesthetics of Toronto 2010s R&B, a brand of R&B that Drake and PARTYNEXTDOOR helped to popularize. So you could say that this record is a celebration of sorts for how that era shaped the modern landscape of R&B. However, there's just very little update or evolution to the style on this album, so the production doesn't really justify the project's existence when put up against a Views or a PND3, because its R&B foundations repeat a lot of the same sonic motifs, just without as much of a bite. That being said, I'll give Drake and P&D credit for getting out of their comfort zone at times, but the result there can feel a little contrived to elicit a reaction rather than come off as genuine detours. So the instrumentals on Meet Your Padre, Die Trying, and Pimmy's Dilemma just come across as diluted and empty, missing elements that could tighten up the overall production's cohesion. The best musical moment on this record is far and away NOKIA, with its switch-ups in tempo providing consistent techno-driven dynamics, laced with Y2K-era pop-R&B textures that are lively and propulsive, especially in its synths, and the icy tones of CN Tower, Mothballs, and Cryin' in Chanel, with its droning staccato synths, faded strings, and muffled vocal samples, proving to be a sleek introduction to the album's atmosphere. Something that I think that the slinky instrumental of Raining in Houston excels at as well, with that fuzzed out guitar in the background, which works far more than the spareness of the Central C-inspired drill of Glorious, that's downright awful and feels like a parody almost. So while there are pockets like NOKIA that are super interesting, and the 2010s R&B seeps into the framework of this record in a flattering way, its deviations from the norm like on the trap heavy cuts, the reggaeton attempts, and the pop rock swings just make it feel like a messy hodgepodge of unfinished, sometimes poorly mixed ideas.
Yeah.
Narrative around the release of this record is a lot of Twitter users coming out of the blue to parrot the sentiment that if you don't get this album, that you don't get bitches, and that this is an album made for fucking and for guys who get pussy. And man, if you gotta say it, it's such weak shit to tell people that if you don't listen to Drake, you don't get pussy. Because that's like women saying to other women, you don't get dick if you don't listen to Katy Perry. It just doesn't make sense. And also, that's just not an assertion that women would make. Because comparatively about this stuff, men are so immature, especially those who are Drake's age and look to his lyrics on this record and other records like it as a Bible. I would say a Bible on relationships, but these people would have to maintain one in order for that to be the case. Look, plenty of music exists for sex, and that's sexy. And it's okay to love music for that reason. I mean, Tyla and Meg and Bryson Tiller and Summer Walker, they make excellent bedroom music. I just don't see how a nearly 40-year-old man discussing sex in this context is all that appealing when every other avenue for steamy R&B does it better, and it also doesn't come from an artist that recently followed a newly turned 18-year-old girl on Instagram. His fans worshiping this. It's just giving, no, Drake has sex. He's the authority of sex. He's the king of sex, actually. And it's just like, I don't think the guy that just got his ass dragged in front of 133.5 million people on live television for being an alleged certified PDF file should be the authority on sex. That's why Some Sexy Songs for You is just a non-starter on the writing front, as it has no intention of demonstrating growth or an ability to say something refreshing while developing this style of R&B. And in the end, it's a project that made me feel icky and uncomfortable, as these two emotionally unstable men prove why they haven't been able to maintain strong connections due to their inherent sexism and misogyny. First of all, the song structures on this record are at times incredibly monotonous and seek nothing but constant self-aggrandizement that replaces opportunities for nuance. I find myself checking how long I had been listening to a song, thinking it was almost over, only for me to realize I was halfway in the middle of a 3-minute track, already starting to feel it sour on me. And that's not counting the painful lyricism and presentation of ideas on Meet Your Padre, that, even if it is a parody, is just structurally bland and soulless, which is the party line of this album. It lacks the depth that classic modern R&B has, classics that even Drake used to produce. In one song, P&D and Drake are encouraging women to go out and shake their asses and have fun, while in others they're pathetically lamenting about women going out and shaking said asses. And it's just this faux simp behavior that masks its troubling worldview on controlling and manipulating women that I find to be weak and developmentally stunted. And I'll admit, it's not sexy hearing P&D talk about his threesomes and Drake talking about how back in the day she wouldn't have had a chance on his come up. I mean, that's rapey. That's creepy. It's not sexy. And I can't think of anything that would get people in the mood less than hearing Drake talk about a girl's tattoo while he's hitting it from the back. I mean, it just lacks any sort of feeling other than numbness.
All the girls.
The use of autotune across this record's first half is pretty abusive, not gonna lie, and I don't think Drake necessarily needs it, especially because his voice can be very commanding, but the effect adds to a droning, lagging impact that gets repetitive and sleepy very quickly for the listener. Something About You has so much low energy, Spider-Man Superman feels like both P&D and Drake are bored to tears, and even the rap-leaning cuts like Brian Steele and Gimme a Hug are examples of things that have worked way better on Honestly Nevermind and Her Loss, so it just rings hollow as obligatory. Drake brings a fun mic presence to NOKIA, which is a huge change of pace, but that kind of win on the performance side is negated by his overall checked out demeanor and the horrendous Spanish accent that he adopts on Meet Your Padre. So we're lucky that P&D is here, because the vibrato on his voice on Mothballs and Deeper is really impressive, and his soulful delivery on Somebody Loves Me is super engaged, and I wouldn't mind seeing him refine this even more on his next solo record. It is just not enough to lift us out of the messiness and perplexing lack of effort from Drake. And it kind of reminds me of Vultures 2 in its presentation, with one performer actually giving a shit, and the other mostly rambling about shit that we don't care about in a manner that's uninspiring. Does anybody feel like the OVO fanbase is becoming a lot more in line with rabid Swifties that feel like their artist deserves every record-breaking metric known to man? Because the whole blacklisting thing is further proof of delusion in this fanbase that clearly doesn't recognize that Drake is still raking in a gargantuan amount of streams. Remember this? Don't be a shill for a multimillionaire that's claiming damages for something he himself has been accused of doing. And I feel like when looking at this gigantic behemoth track listing, the angle behind its fluff and bloat comes off as disingenuous and contrived, aimed at sparking these conversations and conspiratorial discussions. Like seriously, this album is 21 songs in an hour and 14 minutes, and it feels so much longer because so much of its runtime is dedicated to amplifying Drake and P&D's status on the streaming charts. So you get an eclectic, sprawling combination of subgenres that just never fully execute on their initial ideas. So for every strong moment like CN Tower, you get half-assed neo-R&B like Something About You, and thinly written autocrine work on Spider-Man Superman. And eventually you find yourself in the middle of this project swamped in painful reggaeton detours, undercooked takes on drill, and even a pop rock cut in Die Trying that sounds like a Post Malone leftover from 2019. I'm not saying that Drake and P&D don't come through for an occasional hit like NOKIA, which might be the best dance track that Drake has ever released, but it's hard to take this project seriously when euphoric spots like that are so few and far between. They have to sift through self-indulgent slop to find some semblance of life and creativity.
Who's calling that shit? Who's calling that shit? Who's calling that shit? Who's calling that shit? Who? Yeah. OVO sound.
Yeah, this is easily the worst project I've heard from Drake in his entire career, and it's not even close. Plus, it's just a sad testament to the artistic decline from him and PND, which, you know, the latter was only slightly influential, so that's expected. But when you have the highs that Drake has had, this cloying, pandering, dull excuse for getting the party lit shows above all that Drake's an attention whore, which we knew, but it just keeps telling us that he's desperate for a little limelight at the expense of artistic growth. And I'd understand that a bit more if you were 10 years younger, but dude, you are nearing 40. At some point, you gotta grow up, take the L's, find out why you're making music outside of money and fame and constant discourse about you, and just move on. As a fan of Drake myself, I believe we deserve so much more from the guy that gave us Nothing Was the Same, and if you're reading this, it's too late. And honestly, his big, rabid fan base, they deserve more too. But hey, this is my perspective. If you're a Drake fan, don't give in to the bullshit. You can do so much better and has done better in the past. Alright, that's all I got. Bye!